This regular show called Corners of History on KJFF features local historian Guy Selbert telling lesser-known stories of well-known Missourians.
Maybelline, why can't you be true? Oh, Maybelline, why can't you be true? You done start back doing the things you used to do.
Well, good morning. Welcome to the Corners of History.
Good morning.
How you doing, Matthew?
How about that for an introduction?
Yeah.
Man.
That's Charlie Selbert, my very own son, playing one of the very, very first rock and roll songs, Chuck Berry's Maybelline.
Pretty cool stuff.
We're going to talk about Chuck Berry a little bit today. We've been talking about a lot of famous Missourians lately, and of course, you can't pass up Chuck. He was one of the biggest. Chuck was born in St. Louis, 1926, so he is 88 years old.
Wow.
He will be 89 this year.
And still performing.
His schedule is pretty much limited to once a month at Blueberry Hill, but he shows up and plays. If you want to talk about Chuck Berry, you really have to start the conversation with Johnny Johnson. Johnny Johnson, of course, was Chuck Berry's piano player. Johnny Johnson was a jazz pianist, and he came to St. Louis in 1952. He'd been discharged from the Marine Corps during World War II, and his duty in the Marine Corps was he played with Bobby Troupe's big band, and you all know Bobby Troupe because he wrote the song Route 66. But he was older than Chuck, and Chuck was, of course, a very gifted musician, but he had already been to jail before he graduated from high school. After he got out of jail in 1947, he immediately got married and had a kid. Johnson was already an established musician when he came to St. Louis, and he quickly organized a trio here, and they were playing at the Cosmopolitan Club. On New Year's Eve in 1952, Johnson's sax player, Alvin Burnett, suffered a stroke. And the only musician that Johnny Johnson knew of who wouldn't be playing on that night was Chuck Berry, because he was a real raw rookie at the time and didn't have a gig. So he called him, and of course, Berry's guitar playing was pretty much second tier. He also added another new level of entertainment with his vocals and his very entertaining showmanship on the stage. So he stuck. Johnson hired him full time. Johnson had come here by way of Chicago. There he became friends with Muddy Waters. When Muddy Waters heard them, he recommended that they go to Chess Records in Chicago and present them with some material because Chess might give them a contract. So they showed up, and they played quite a number of their rhythm and blues tunes for Chess, but the rhythm and blues market at that point was shrinking, and Chess wasn't really interested in it. But then when they played, it was really a send-up of a country song called Ida Red. The Chess brothers liked it, but Leonard Chess wanted it to have a stronger beat, so he added a bass player and a maraca player to the trio. He also rewrote some of the words to make it more sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, he wanted to be about fast cars and the kind of typical kind of commercialism that was part and parcel of rock and roll. They were arguing about the name, and Chess saw somebody had left a mascara box behind in the studio. And Chess saw the mascara box, and he said, "Oh, hell, let's call the damn thing Maybelline." And they changed the spelling so they wouldn't get in trouble with
Maybelline makeup, yeah.
With the makeup company. And that was the story of the first recording of Maybelline. I mean, they really kind of designed this record in the studio. And it was that country flavor, and particularly the guitar licks, which he really kind of just lifted from popular country music of the day. And his style, when he played, he doesn't sound black. And that was an important part of his success, because a lot of the kids, of course, this is 1955.
A lot of friction going on.
The bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama is 1956. So, I mean, there was a lot of tension, racial tension then. And there were a lot of people that just didn't realize that he was a black man. And a lot of kids are dancing to his music. And so the incredible thing about Maybelline, it's recorded in May of 55. By September of 55, it's number one on the rhythm and blues charts. But it's also up in the top 20 or so in the country charts, and it's in the top 10 in the pop charts. So these were all racially segregated. Rhythm and blues was pretty much black. These were race records. And overall, Maybelline in September of 1955 was number one on the Billboard chart.
Hey, Dad, tell him who Johnny B. Good was written for.
Well, it was actually written as a memorial to Johnny Johnson.
Tribute.
Yeah,
memorial.
Yeah.
Johnny was still,
He was still alive. And the Be Good was actually a reference to Johnny Johnson's habit of drinking a great deal. And eventually, Chuck prohibited drinking while they were on tour. And he said he wouldn't allow them to drink in the car, so they would lean out the window. Chuck had a real problem, and the real problem was more with the government than with the law. He was accused. He opened a nightclub in St. Louis called Barry's Club Bandstand. And in 1959, he was accused of a violation of the Mann Act. There was a big problem with bringing prostitutes in from across the river, and people would go across the river to avoid prosecution because laws were mostly state laws. So there was a federal act passed in the 1920s called the Mann Act, and it was if you brought a woman across state lines for illicit purposes, that is, for prostitution, you could be prosecuted under the Mann Act. Well, it was never intended to be used the way it ended up being used. It was used as a persecution more than a prosecution. And that's what happened to Chuck. He was accused. He gave this girl a ride to work. She lived on the east side. She was actually an American Indian. She was an Apache, and she was only 14 at the time. But it was legal for her to work there. I don't know why, but it was. And she was a hat check girl. So they accused Chuck of having sex with her and violating the Mann Act. And, the transcript of the trial is just a travesty. I mean, he was called everything but a decent person. He wasn't prosecuted on the state level. He was prosecuted by the feds. Well, remember who was the head of the FBI at that time? J. Edgar Hoover.
I was just thinking of like J. Edgar and his pink nightie or something like
that.
Yeah,
right.
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
And this is no joke. J. Edgar Hoover wore women's underwear.
Cross-dresser, yes.
Yeah.
Interesting fellow.
But he despised rock and roll. I mean, absolutely despised it. And he despised black people. And he used absolutely every trick in the book to prosecute black rock and roll artists. We're running out of time.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe we ought to
we ought to
close
play
a
some
little
music.
Yeah, play a little Johnny Be Good. Hail, hail, rock and roll.
Yeah. This is
Love you, Chuck.
Corners of History. We're going to talk about Walt Disney today.
All right.
Because Walt Disney grew up for a time in Marceline. Marceline was established in 1888, I think. It was a division town, the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe Railroad between Chicago and Kansas City. And his uncle was a conductor on the Santa Fe, and that's the reason that a train goes all the way around Disney World. If you visit Marceline and you've been to Disneyland or Disney World, you'll think, golly, I've been here before. And that's because the downtown of Marceline was the model for
Main Street USA.
Main Street USA's in Disneyland and the various Disney Worlds. And you'll also find, I think it's Marceline's Confectionery or something like that, on Main Street, as if it belonged to somebody named Marceline, but it's actually named after the town. If you go there today, the old railroad station is a Disney museum, and the little theater in the middle of the town, you just walk in for free, and they run Disney cartoons continuously. There are loudspeakers all around town, and they play music from Disney movies, and so it's a pretty Disney-oriented town today. Walt Disney came to Marceline in 1906. He was born in 1901, and his father was Elias Disney, and he got a 40-acre farm. They were only there for 4 years, but you can still visit the old homestead there, and there's a big barn, and you can go inside and actually sign your name. But I wanted to talk a little bit about Disney today, and it's easy to talk about his lifetime, but everybody has a lifetime. And what I wanted to talk about was the real big things that happened to Disney and the way he completely revolutionized the making of cartoons. In 1910, the family moved to Kansas City, and his father bought a paper route for him and his brother Roy, and they delivered papers. And talk about child labor laws, they shattered them. He got up at 4:30 every morning, worked until school started, and then after school was over, he then went and delivered the evening paper until it was supper time. So the kid was working like 10 hours a day and going to school, and he kept falling asleep in class, so he didn't do real well in school in Kansas City. In 1917, the family moved back to Chicago, and Walt was taking some classes at the Art Institute. In 1917, the war was going on, and Walt wanted to join the Army. So he quit school when he was 16, and he tried to enlist in the Army, but he was too young. They wouldn't take him. So he got a job as an ambulance driver for the Red Cross. But by the time he got to France, the war was over. There was still a lot of work to do. for ambulance drivers, so he was an ambulance driver for a year in France, and he was able to save up some money. He came back to Chicago and gave the money to his mother to keep for him, but he didn't want to stay in Chicago, so he came back to Kansas City, and he got a job for a short time at Gray's Advertising Agency. He was only there for 6 weeks, and he got fired. But the big thing that happened to him at Gray's was that he made friends with a guy named Ubi Iwerks. And Ubi Iwerks and he became lifetime friends. And they decided to set up their own advertising agency. They were both 18 years old at the time.
Wow.
And they went into business. And they went back to a customer that they had at Gray's and offered to do some freelance for them. So following some negotiation, they were doing freelance work in exchange for their office space. And that's when they decided to get into cartooning. And they founded a studio, which they called Iwerks Disney. The problem was they founded this company in Kansas City, and Disney put a studio together there. But he was paying these people more than he could afford. Although they were selling their work, they weren't selling it for enough, and Disney Iwerks went bankrupt. So Disney went to work as a freelance photographer for a few months and saved up enough money to buy a ticket to the West Coast. He and his brother went out together, he and Roy. Roy was the financial brains of the outfit, and they went into business together. This is where it really gets interesting, and there's a bunch of history that I'll just touch on very lightly. Iwerks created a character called Oswald the Rabbit.
Yes, who got stolen, correct?
Well, it wasn't stolen. They signed him away to Universal Studios, and Walt was surprised to find out when he went to ask for a raise that he didn't own Oswald the Rabbit, that the contract that he had signed had kind of tricked him into selling not only Oswald the Rabbit, but gave Universal control over his own studio and his own cartoonists. And when he had gone to New York to ask for a raise, when he left New York, he was unemployed.
Wow.
So this is the amazing thing about Disney. He was never discouraged by this, and it happened over and over and over again. He just kept picking himself up. So he and Iwerks, he had a pet mouse in Kansas City, and he had drawn that pet mouse quite often. And Iwerks actually re-envisioned the pet mouse. Disney had called it Mortimer Mouse. Iwerks and Lillian was Disney's wife, talked him into renaming him Mickey Mouse. In 1923, they came up with all of that business, and Iwerks came up with a new kind of a camera called a multiplane camera that would shoot these transparencies on several different levels, and you could move the transparencies under the camera one frame at a time, and you would move the bottom transparency slowly, and the middle, as you went up in transparencies, in cells, you would move them faster and faster, and it gave the perception of depth to the cartoons. So this was an enormous breakthrough. And in 1934, because they had the technology was developed, by the way, Iwerks was not working for him in that time. They had a feud in 1930, and they split up, and they didn't reunite again until 1940. So he was working for himself when he developed the multiplane camera, but Disney used it and redeveloped it over and over again. And when they shot Snow White, beginning in 1934, one of his employees, William Garrity, invented the most innovative multiplane camera, and it was vertical in design. Iwerks' camera was horizontal. Of course, they don't use that system anymore. They use CGI. But it's much the same technique, and that's the interesting thing about it. In Snow White, which took 4 years to make, and Disney actually spent every dime he had and ran out of money, and he had to show a rough cut of Snow White to bankers to get them to loan him the money to finish the thing. So he really bet the farm. The movie was, of course, phenomenally successful. It made
Especially
over
for that time.
$8 million. It was the number one movie of 1938, and it set Disney up forever. And that would be the equivalent of $135 million today. Walt was not an easy guy. He was a red baiter. His cartoonists went on strike in 1941, and after the war, he went in front of Congress and accused them all of being communists. In a lot of ways, he was not a nice guy. He fell in love with Werner von Braun, who was a Nazi and used slave labor to build his V-2 rockets. There's some questionable ethical conundrums that surround Disney. He smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, and he died of cancer in 1966 when he was 65 years old. But he changed everything.